Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about the British miniseries Behind Her Eyes. The plot initially centers on this woman named Louise, who's a single mom living in the Islington borough of London. She works as a part-time secretary and doesn't really have much exciting going on in her life outside of being a mom, so she hires a babysitter to look after her son while she goes out for a night in the town at some random bar that she goes to in the first episode. She ends up meeting a guy at the bar that she goes to named David, and it's pretty cliche how they end up meeting up. She ends up spilling her drink on him, she apologizes, he says no, don't worry about it, it's okay, and then the whole incident ends up kicking off some sort of relationship between them. They talk to each other at the bar for a long time, then they go outside, they say, no, we're not going to have sex tonight, but they do end up kissing on their way out of the door. And it just so happens the very next day at the clinic that Louise works as a secretary at, she finds out that her new boss, the psychiatrist that's going to lead the clinic, happens to be the guy that she met at the bar named David. Pretty convenient how she ended up meeting him literally the night before, if I say so myself. It gets more intriguing, however, when she finds out that not only is David going to be her new boss, but he's also married. It shows David and his wife having a meeting with some other corporate bigwig in the same room, and as they're talking, Louise starts freaking out and she's like, oh crap, I'm in some sort of love triangle right now. And that's basically in a nutshell what Behind Her Eyes ends up being. It starts off as a love triangle, and then as the story goes on, it ends up becoming a psychological thriller with a big dark web of lies and intrigue that Louise has to sift her way through and try to solve a mystery. The mystery largely revolves around Adele, who's David's wife in the show, and her tragic past that she had whenever she was 18 years old when her family house burned down, her parents died, and she ended up being passed out from being overdosed on drugs, and she ended up getting sent off to rehab in order to get better. They go into a crazy amount of depth for Adele's backstory, and Louise has to try to sift through all the details as she tries to understand why she's acting so strangely whenever she's around him, and especially so whenever she's around David. Because it's such a character-centered show, and we have to study and examine all these little minute plot details that come along as the show progresses, it would be remiss of me if I didn't continue on without first examining the characters of the story. Louise, as I mentioned before, is kind of the main character of the show, although she's not really the main focus of it, if that makes any sense. As I said, she's a single mom to her son Adam, and she always walks him over to school, Kingsbridge Primary School I think it was, if my memory serves correctly, and she walks him to school and then walks him back, and that's kind of what her life is like. There's not really much interesting going on in the way of personality. There is one thing, however, that does make her stand out a little bit from the rest of the characters. It's the fact that she has these night terrors in pretty much every episode of the show. All these night terrors end up being is basically her son Noah runs away from her and she's trying to catch up with him. And at first he's acting playful, he's laughing, he's having a good time, but as the dream sequence goes on, the terror, whatever you want to call it, he eventually starts screaming in terror, and that results in Louise panicking, which usually results in her waking up in some very dangerous situation, like she's about to go over her apartment balcony or something like that. I did like that they tried to make Louise a sympathetic character in this regard, but ultimately it wasn't really enough for me to get invested in her as a character. She just doesn't really do much interesting, which is kind of the point of the first episode, I realize that, but it doesn't really improve as the show goes on. She's just a blank canvas that we're supposed to draw meaning from while every episode progresses and she's trying to put the pieces together in the mystery that she's trying to solve. And speaking of the mystery, I have to go on and talk about David in this regard. Again, just like Louise, he's really not all that interesting. He talks a big game about how he's going to do all this outreach work and he's going to change people's lives, but we never see him do that in the show. He just kind of goes to work and then comes back home and he just acts all somber and despondent and just really depressed at times. And as you watch the show, it makes sense why he acts the way he does and how he ends up being depressed. It all revolves around Adele and how she's not the woman she seems to be. But again, it's just not enough for me to get invested in him. If you're going to write a character and make him say that he's going to do this, that he's going to do that, make him do this or that. Just make him do something other than give him some half-assed alcoholism trait. By the way, yeah, that's another thing about the show. The show makes David out to be this alcoholic and how he's always getting drunk all the time. And I mean, yeah, he does have a Macallan whiskey in his desk drawer and something like that, and you shouldn't really have that at your office, but you never really see him explore the alcoholism trait. He usually just drinks like half a glass of wine or something like that really quickly, and we never really see his personality beyond that. He just acts like the same jerk throughout the show. That was another thing that annoyed me about David, was the fact that he was such a miserable bastard throughout the entire show. Again, I understand why he was written that way. It's because of everything that it revolves around Adele in the story. But again, it doesn't make me sympathize with him that much. It's just the same cliched, half-assed alcoholic character that we've seen in pretty near every other drama that's like this. Just because your character is an alcoholic doesn't make me automatically sympathize with him. And I understand that the show goes into detail of how good of a person he was in the past, but you should be trying to show him doing good things right now in the show. That's what I think anyway. I was kind of disappointed with how they handled Louise and David's relationship in the show. Not just because they were two boring characters paired together, but their relationship together never really went anywhere. It just ended up being purely sexual and trying to get off whatever energy they had. Which leads me into the third main character of the show, and fourth depending on how you think about it, Adele. Adele is David's enigmatic ex-drug addict wife. Adele as a character is very unique compared to David. Unlike David, who's pretty much miserable throughout the entire show, Adele is much more optimistic by comparison. She actually tries her best to go out and have a good time, to try and meet people. She goes shopping, she does all sorts of things like going to the gym to fill in her spare time. And it makes us that much more invested in her as a character because we actually see her doing something and enjoying life, but at the same time, we know that there are problems that are affecting her as a character, and it makes us that much more invested trying to figure out just what is going on in her head. I don't know, I just thought Adele was much better written and had way more personality compared to Louise and David, especially as the story goes on. The show has a ton of flashback sequences in particular that are fully dedicated to Adele and her stint in rehab, all the while she's meeting up with this guy named Rob. Rob is basically her close confidant that she has in rehab. Like with her, he's an addict as well, but unlike her, he's not really interested in changing his life circumstances. He's kind of the mindset that once an addict, always an addict. And all these scenes of dialogue that happened between Adele and Rob, they just made me appreciate her that much more as a character because, again, they actually showed her unveiling her struggles and what she was going through in her life. With Louise, they just kind of show the aftermath of what happened between her and her former husband. I mean, yeah, they show the ex-husband here and there, and they show that they do have a friendly dynamic with each other, but other than that, that's it. They don't really kind of show the circumstances that went into Louise divorcing with her husband, other than a brief scene of her talking with her son at the park. Whereas with Adele, we get scene after scene after scene of showing what kind of thoughts she's going through, the interactions that she has with her husband David on the phone, all the while Rob is kind of spying and taking notes on Adele and just taking as much information as he can. He actually writes in this little red notebook, and Louise gets the notebook later on in the story while she's trying to solve the mystery in the show. So as a psychological thriller in this regard, the show wasn't really all that bad. Even though most of the characters didn't really have all that much personality to begin with, they made up for it with some really intense scenes. There's this one character in particular where we're led to believe that this random character's cat is dead, but it ends up being not the case. And the whole build-up to the kind of reveal at the end of that scene was really well done. Pretty much any scene where Adele is on camera is absolutely spot on in terms of tension, in terms of character development, pretty much any sort of story element that you can think of. Adele was fantastic as a character. We see her run through the whole gamut of emotions in the show. We see her when she's happy, when she's sad, when she's angry, and everything else in between. She was just absolutely amazingly well written, well done character across the board. The best scenes that feature Adele in this show is whenever she's going against David's wishes and she leaves the house to try and do her own thing. And that was something that I found really weird in the show. The fact that David is so controlling of Adele and where she's at constantly, and yet we're supposed to believe that David doesn't really care about the relationship, that he's just sort of passionateless and would rather seek thrills from Louise. So the fact that Adele plays this suffering housewife, but again still tries to go out and do her own thing, I love that they didn't make her just a completely submissive housewife and she wanted to go out and be her own person. But for each thrilling scene that does appear in the show, whether it involves Adele or someone else, it feels like there's another scene that completely negates the point of it. Louise's night terrors end up disappearing toward the end of the show, pretty much without any warning. I mean, there is a reason that goes into why those night terrors disappear, but I didn't think the reason for it made any sense whatsoever. So basically, once those night terrors disappeared, any reason that I had left to care about Louise as a character went out the window. Also, there's a random angle involving a drug addict that happens early on in the show. It shows this addict that kind of mouths off Louise at the beginning, but David takes him outside to talk with him, and that made no sense to me at all. There is no way that you would have a confidential conversation with a client outside on the street in public where everyone can hear you. I'm sorry, but that just does not happen. You would think David, being a famed psychiatrist and knowing how to do his job very well, especially someone who's new to the job and wanted to make a good first impression, you would think that he would try to keep that conversation under wraps and away from everyone else who could drop in on them, but apparently that was not the case. And the stupidity from that whole drug addict angle continues whenever the guy knocks on David's doorstep and he finds out that Adele has a black eye. Adele had a black eye because she was going to relapse and wanted to go out in the street and find someone who dealt drugs, specifically heroin, but she ends up getting punched in the face by someone who didn't think that she was serious about the offer. So anyway, the addict goes to David's place, notices the black eye in Adele, and immediately assumes that David hit her in the face, was physical, violent towards her. And then there is a part later on that episode where it's brought up and the bigwig that's at the office says, "These are serious accusations, David. You know what you're getting into with this?" And David said, "I didn't hit her. Call her and you can prove it right now." And sure enough, the guy calls up Adele and says, "Hey, did David hit you?" And she says, "No, he didn't. I hit my face in my kitchen cupboard. That's it. End of story." As you watch the show later on, that scene does make sense in hindsight when you look back on it. It still frustrated me because they don't really go anywhere with that drug addict after it's all said and done. In fact, they even go so far as to show the addict interacting with Adele as they trade money for heroin and they walk off hand in hand, as if the whole incident never occurred. It just felt like there was some sort of weird balancing act between intense scenes and scenes that were supposed to be intense but ultimately ended up falling flat. By far though, the absolute number one thing that everyone is talking about with this show is the ending. It's pretty much one of the main selling points of this show to begin with, because I found out that it was actually advertised from the book that this show is based on. The fact that it was advertised in London Underground ads and things like that, they basically said, don't trust this book. And to be honest, when I see something like that, that immediately raises red flags in my head. It's jarring and cheap enough whenever you have to deal with a bad plot twist halfway through the story or whenever it may occur, but the fact that they were advertising that as the selling point for the show, the fact that there is a plot twist, and they make that the number one selling point, I thought was really cheap. If you want to have plot twists in your movies or TV shows or any sort of medium like that, whatever, that's fine. There are plenty of examples of great plot twists and narratives. But this ending was one of the most frustrating endings that I ever had to witness on television. It only lasts for about 15 or 20 minutes, but it basically just kind of unravels the whole show for me. This is going to be your spoiler warning, by the way, so if you don't want to watch this review anymore and you want to skip ahead to where my ultimate verdict lies, then feel free to skip ahead. I'll have a time code in the video to show you where to go to, but otherwise, keep watching. Okay, so the concept of astral projection is explored throughout the end of episode 5 and most of episode 6. Basically, it's this idea that you can project your mental self out of your body and travel to any other place that you've been to as some sort of floating metaphysical energy. So the fact that they took a supernatural twist on things way out of nowhere toward the end of the story was very jarring for me. I didn't like that aspect. That was bad enough for me, but then it gets even worse at the very end. Rob ends up transferring his mind over to Adele's body, and then Adele ends up transferring her mind over to Rob's body. Rob in Adele's body ends up killing Adele in Rob's body and convinces David to hide Rob's body, who is actually Adele. The reason why Rob does this is because for some reason, for reasons we cannot explain, Rob falls in love with David within one day of meeting him. It showed Rob earlier in the show going to visit Adele and David where they lived to kind of celebrate the fact that he got out of rehab and because he wanted to see his friend that he made in rehab. And it revealed right from the very beginning of the show that Rob was gay, that he was not into women at all. But for some reason it felt like the obvious. To me, it always felt like he was falling in love with Adele as the story went on. All of these scenes that we see play out between Rob and Adele, I thought they were going to go for some sort of bisexual angle in the show and end up making him fall in love with Adele after all. But apparently that wasn't the case. Apparently Rob isn't very picky when it comes to his choice of guys. He just immediately falls in love with David at first sight and assumes that everything will work out, that he's the man for him, that he'll do anything that it takes in order to get with him. I hated that angle of the story. There is no reason for Rob to fall in love with David as a character. Not just the fact that David doesn't have any personality to begin with, but also we don't show Rob really interacting with David other than 1 or 2 scenes. Everything else that Rob hears about David is just kind of hearsay that he hears from Adele whenever they're at the rehab clinic together. He just hears a bunch of nice things that David's girlfriend Adele says about him, and Rob just immediately assumes that that's his dream man. And the fact that Rob went to such extreme supernatural lengths in order to get what he wanted was just really stupid in my opinion. That is not the only stupid thing that happens in the show, however. Toward the end of episode 6, it shows Adele getting ready to commit suicide, and she threatens so whenever she's talking to Louise, whenever everything kind of unravels and there's a big confrontation between the two. Louise ends up having the confidence and ability to project herself astrally, which again is a very stupid plot point. It makes 0 sense whatsoever. And unlike any other sensible person in Louise's shoes, what they would normally do whenever someone threatens suicide is call the cops and try to prevent them from doing so. Rather than doing that, she takes matters into her own hands, races to the house, which is on fire at this point. She ends up lighting the whole place up on fire, and she tries to find a way in, but she can't find her way in. Every window is locked, every door is locked, etc. So Louise ends up astrally projecting herself, goes into Adele's room in her house, while Adele's metaphysical form, or whatever it is in the corner of the room waiting for her to make the next move. Once that happens, Adele's form races down to where Louise's body is, and then both of them take each other's bodies. Ignoring the fact that Adele, as Louise, seems to have no problem opening up a door, when Louise, as Louise, ended up having tons of issues trying to open the door, putting that fact aside, what the hell? I mean, seriously, what the hell? Rob, as Adele, ends up taking over Louise, so now Rob is in Louise's body, and he thinks that because David had a sexual relationship with Louise, that Rob, as Louise, stands the next best chance of getting with David in a relationship. Oh my god. This is ridiculous. Seriously, I was tearing my hair out by this point in the story. I would have been offended at the idea of a white man taking over a black woman's body and just trying to figure out the repercussions that would come with that. But I was so dumbfounded with this show's story by the end of it anyway. I was just like, I can't really find anything to be offended because it's just so hilariously dumb. I looked into the concept of astral projection after I finished watching the show, and it turns out, at least from what I've seen anyway, that only high-ranking members of Buddhist society, or pretty much anyone who's very experienced in the art of meditation, are supposedly able to pull this off. Basically, no random Joe can just learn to magically project their mental selves all across every location that they've ever been to. It just doesn't work that way. And the fact that they pull this crap off within the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, giving us little time to digest everything that we just seen and just expect us to lap it all up, I'm sorry, but that was just absolutely unacceptable for me. There's a lot of other things that I could rant about this show and all the problems that I had with it, but if I talked about every little thing in this show, I would be talking here all day. It's 6 episodes long, and each episode is an hour long, so basically it's like a movie every episode. So I just simply don't have as much time to talk about this show as I would have liked to, but my ultimate verdict is it was very disappointing. It feels like most people are pretty evenly split when it comes to opinions about this show. On one hand, it seems that most regular audiences really love this show, but the critics, on the other hand, aren't quite so forgiving. The main problems that I had with this show was that most of the characters just weren't all that interesting. There wasn't really much to grab from them. The story goes from being a psychological thriller to being supernatural hocus-pocus nonsense that has poor reasoning behind it, and as I said, the ending was absolutely unfulfilling. At the same time, however, there are things that this show does get right. Whenever it does pull off psychologically thrilling scenes, it does so brilliantly. The cinematography of all the streets of London, all the architecture around the place is an absolute feast for the eyes, and of course, as I already mentioned, Adele and Rob to a certain extent are amazing characters. Just extremely well acted, well written, all across the board. I was invested in their journey from beginning to the end, even if that end ultimately didn't appeal to me. So it puts me in kind of an awkward position between the middle. I didn't really hate it as much as other people did, but I also didn't like it as much as others did too. It kind of just feels like someone's first ever psychological thriller show that they ever made. It's not really a bad show, but there are definitely better shows that have come before and will come after this. At the end of the day, however, it is a harmless show and it's based off novels, and I'm not really a fan of novels anyway, just because I find that most novels that are written these days, they're a little too fantastical for me, as was the case with this show, which was based on a novel. If you don't really have anything else to watch and you want to see a character-driven story that has some psychological thriller elements to it, and you don't necessarily mind having a crazy ending, then I think this show would be right up your alley. For me, this show was fine in parts, but it was also frustrating in parts. So overall, I can't really complain, but I can't really praise it either. It's just pretty okay for me. Anyways, guys, that's gonna be my review of Behind Her Eyes. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Taiwanese comedy, Classmates Minus. Bye-bye.